All righty then. Hello, everyone. This and that, uh, 221, February 21st. It's a slight detour, not so much of a big detour. We were still looking at ideas about subsumption and sublation. And I think there are things that can sort those notions out. And what I wanted to appeal to is a slightly different direction, although in one sense, it's a return to a kind of prior set of beliefs, particularly Etienne Balibar studied under um, Althusser, and he's still alive. So there's this little piece that was done a couple of years ago from generalized surplus value to total subsumption, and I came across it in a book called Capitalism Concept, Idea, Image Aspects of Marx's Capital Today, edited by Osborne, Allier, and Russell, the same Russell who wrote the other thing the other day. And this particular chapter is towards a new critique of political economy from generalized surplus value to total subsumption. So I will get right on this. We have other things to do this evening. Adnan is going to appear in after hours, so looking forward to that. Um, so let's get on with it. In the formula, a new critique of political economy, everything is problematic. It clearly alludes to Marx reproducing the title or subtitle of the works in which he proposed his revolutionary theory of the capitalist mode of production. But other criticisms are unthinkable, diverging at a certain point or based on antithetic assumptions. The term political economy is being reintroduced today with the perception that a more specialized formula, such as economics, far from securing greater scientificity, in fact, covers specific political interests. However, it harbors considerable enigmas, in particular with respect to the delimitation of its object. Does it refer here to a discourse, since we know that Marx distinguished between classical political economy, where he found some of the foundations of his own theory of capitalism, and a vulgar economy, which in fact prefigures what would become mainstream economic theory in the 20th century? Or does it refer to the project of a political economy in general? And so this is sort of a work in progress, and it appears, or a further development of this about a absolute capitalism appears in a text that I uploaded to our Discord. So you might want to look at that. You don't have to, certainly. But it's a kind of a wide-ranging text, but it is associated with this particular text. So, in which case, Marxism itself might become at the same time the subject and the object of criticism. The issue can also be addressed from a different angle. The so-called vulgar economy has survived the Marxian sentence of death very well, not only for reasons having to do with power relations in academia, at least in the United States, but also because it could appear that Marxism was dismissive of central determinations of the actual capitalist economy, an impression that gained strength from observation of the failure of Marxist socialist economic policies. But here again, we should remember that things are more complicated than a simple partisan choice, because certain heterodox currents of Marxism that actually take into account questions and categories that had been invented by post-classical economists. And it can be shown that mainstream economists are in many respects replying to Marx, and therefore use him in a dialectical manner. Hence the questions that are latent in the adjective new. Does the new critique of political economy refer to the critique of a new or relatively new political economy which Marx did not know, or that, because of the blindness inherent in his own lucidity, he made it difficult for Marxists to take seriously as an expression of certain structures and tendencies of capitalism? Would such a new or renewed critique consist in a continuation of the Marxian critique, addressing the continuation of the discourse of economic theory? Or would it try to invent a different critique, albeit bearing an analogy with the Marxist critique in its relationship to contemporary economic discourse? Or should it represent an altogether new kind of critique, given the fact that the modality of the Marxian critique depended on philosophical and sociological assumptions that have become part of the problem? And finally, what would be the articulation in this new critique of the critical dimension which addresses discourses and the critical dimension which addresses institutions, social structures, historical tendencies? These dilemmas are abstract and they're not exhaustive. I'll keep them in mind while I propose some elements that are suggested by current debates and conditions. I submit that the weaknesses, aporias, or points of stress in Marx's own critique of political economy as a critique of capitalism are always located in the immediate vicinity of its strengths, or what we would call the truths of Marxism. They act like a shadow of those truths, which in different circumstances makes everything obscure. This explains why I shall discuss first the core category of Marx's argument in Capital, which connects the analysis of exploitation to the analysis of accumulation, namely the category of surplus value. I will propose a notion of generalized surplus value, which is liberated from the restrictions imposed by Marx's dependency upon Smith and Ricardo to reach a problematic of total subsumption, which I hope makes it possible to better understand the domination of financial capital over everyday life in the era of neoliberal globalization. First section is capital as social relation. As we know, this is the common good of the various critical readings of Marx's Capital in the 20th century. The core of Marx's critique resides in introducing the structural category of social relation instead of the fetishism of commodities and persons. Capital is not a thing, not even a thing handled and processed by capitalists and other agents, or a symbolic, therefore intrinsically social thing, such as an amount of money, a deposit, or a bank account that can be appropriated and invested in various manners. It is in itself a social relation, therefore a relationship among social agents, individuals, and above all, classes, in which they perform specific roles which are complementary but also antagonistic. This immediately shows that the category social relation cannot become separated from the category of process. The social relation is constituted in the course of a process made, made of several intertwined processes where moments of exchange alternate with moments of consumption and production. And the process is supposed to perpetuate and more technically to reproduce the social relation in all its conditions, material, financial, institutional. But as Marx soon reveals, a reproduction, especially if it's an expanded reproduction, must also be a transformation. Capital is a process that cannot realize itself socially and historically without transforming itself within or beyond certain structural limits. All this becomes clear only if we specify the kind of relation, therefore the kind of society effect we are talking about, in order to endow the process with its orientation and driving force. Let us say that the orientation of the process is accumulation, an objective that is always already set as a prerequisite when the process starts again, that is, in the form of money capital, seeking places and modalities of investment. And the specific nature of the relation is characterized by the fact that, however multiple they may appear at the level of society at large, social interdependencies subjected to the law of accumulation ultimately rely on or are reducible to an antagonistic relationship of exploitation of wage labor within the production processes. This is, of course, not a simple notion, because we need to explain how a relationship of antagonism can also be a complementarity, without which it could not serve the life, the reproduction of the society as such, even at the cost of more or less dynamic contradictions. And we also need to explain how we articulate the immediate forms of a social relationship in which wage laborers confront their antagonists, that is, the direct and indirect owners and managers of capital, with social relations at the level of society, which are relations among classes, a general distribution of property and incomes, and a distribution of power, where many social functions and differences are involved. No longer intersubjective relations of exploitation and domination, but objective relations of society with itself, which are continuously evolving. Now, using the Althusserian expression, I take this to be, in general terms, the philosophical core of Marx's epistemological break. The break is not only a rejection of previous ideological representations of capital, which in Marx's dialectical theory goes along with explaining why these ideological representations are necessary, even functional in certain conditions. In other words, they're part of the social relation itself. The break is just a breakthrough, opening problems whose solutions are not possible by just developing the premises. The very same formulas that express the invention involve obstacles which become apparent retrospectively in the course of the confrontation with actual historical transformations of capitalism. This is where a strategy of deconstruction becomes necessary, which identifies obstacles and difficulties at the very core of the theoretical invention, tracing their origin in the way its fundamental concepts have been defined. Nothing must remain untouched, but nothing must be rejected or rectified without understanding at the same time what it explained, as well as what consequences, in particular political consequences, any rectification will have. Next section, epistemological obstacles in Marx. The main epistemological obstacles in Marx, from our contemporary point of view, are located at the intersection of the two great ways of defining capital in a Marxist sense, which for Marx are complementary. In fact, two sides of the same model. Capital is a process of exploitation relying normally on the hiring of wage labor, which Marx sometimes calls in Hegelian fashion the essential relation. And capital is a process of unlimited accumulation in monetary form through the maximization of profits, whose main part must be recreated if it can. Always, of course, a big problem and a potential contradiction.
Oh,
These two notions are not
did I
synonymous.
lose you?
Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Is everyone still? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. I will continue. These two notions are not synonymous, far from it. In a sense, they refer to different social relations or different aspects of the social mechanism, but in Marx's view, they're strictly correlative. If you have the first, you have the second. And if you have the second, you have the first. Why are there problems arising at this intersection? Well, they arise in particular, first, from the fact that for Marx, capital ultimately is nothing other than capitalized labor. Therefore, labor is not just one production factor among many others, as mainstream economic theory would explain. Second, from the way in which Marx relates labor to the money form. And third, from the way in which he attributes productivity to labor. The key concept on which Marx's argument about exploitation and accumulation completely relies in Capital is valorization. However, if we return to the German text, we see that two words can be translated in this manner, corresponding to different ideas. Now, of course, they're articulated, but the question is how? One is Wertbildung, which means literally formation of value. The underlying idea is that in every society where goods are produced in the commodity form, their exchange value must be determined by some common substance of which it is the expression. Marx knows from the classical economists that this substance is labor, but he adds the precision that the labor here is an abstract social labor, not an observable empirical magnitude, but the implicit or imminent result of the equalization taking place behind the market or in its interstices as a result of the exchange itself. There's a kind of circle here because abstract labor exists if commodities are exchanged in a proportion that more or less directly depends upon the amount of abstract labor that they embody. Now, the main difficulty, however, arises when it comes to articulating valorization in this sense of Wertbildung with valorization in its properly capitalistic sense as Wertwertung, that is, the valorization of value, as it were. In other words, the addition of new value or the emergence from within the circulation process itself of additional value. So you can see the emergence of thinking about cycles. Capitalists invest money and measure value or calculate prices only because they want to maximize that surplus, to generate surplus value. And in fact, it's not the case that value is formed on the market before values enter a process of their own increase. That is, the reverse is true. There is valorization in the first sense, that is, the formation of value, because there is valorization in the second sense, that is, the generation of surplus value. Now, the fact that you can see that one is, dependent or codependent on the other, that you already see that there's a circuit. This means, in other words, that the market of commodities is already a capitalist market, and ultimately the abstract social labor is an exploited social labor in the form of wage labor. It all seems, apparent. It is wage labor, therefore capitalism, that homogenizes and equalizes labor. Now, other difficulties are linked to this axiomatic circle, as I just described it. In order to explain how the increment arises, Marx must explain that the value of the means of production is already there. It's just like a treasure or stock constituted by past materialized labor, to which living labor, that is, labor in the present, will add new value in given proportion. Two conditions are required, which form the secret of the productivity of labor, that as concrete labor, it preserves or rather recreates the value of machinery and raw material used in the process, and that as abstract labor, it creates new value in a measurable quantity. But in fact, none of this is determined. It makes sense only as an anticipation of the value realized on the market. That is, when the product is sold and converted into money in a completely aleatory manner. Hence, a considerable aporia, namely the fact that Marx, who more than any other theorist insists on the fact that value only exists in monetary form, also has a tendency to neutralize the function of money and return to a real representation of the economic circuit, which, contrary to capitalist logic, it's not money that commands the circulation of commodities, but commodities that relate to themselves and express their relations in the fetishistic form of money operations. Now, this leads ultimately to the fact that Marx, in the unfinished volume 3 of Capital, called the operations of credit, and therefore the whole financial process a fictitious capital. Now, this is a terribly ambiguous formula in which one may understand that capitalism really operates through the use of fictions, that is, symbolic instruments with a conventional institutional foundation, or that the real capitalism, with its historical tendencies and transformation, must be explained purely in forms of labor relations, an organic composition of past and present labor, by abstracting from the fact that they are subjected to the monetary constraint of realization. This is a dramatic difficulty when it comes to discussing contemporary development of financialized capitalism, and it runs the risk of throwing us into the opposite discourse. That is, thinking capitalism as a pure financial process where credit money and its derivatives unfold their own autonomous productivity, generate profits without any apparent relation to a production process, or more generally to a social relation where the value becomes metamorphosed successfully in its different forms. That is, the money form, the commodity form, a metamorphosis without which there would be no valorization in either sense. For the valorization of value to take place, value must change form. It must even, as Marx also says, permanently shift from one scene onto another, from the scene of monetary exchanges onto the scene of productive consumption. A symmetric difficulty concerns labor, starting from the idea of the double character of labor, which explains the double aspect of valorization. There remain two ways of identifying labor in Marx's argument. The tension is made apparent by the very polysemic use of the category productivity, Produktivkraft. On the one hand, productive labor refers to any activity transformed into a field of investment for capital. In my previous terminology, any metamorphosis of monetary value into its polar opposite, a material or immaterial elaboration of the use value of commodities, will produce surplus value. It generates an increment that can become capitalized or accumulated, or it is productive in the capitalist sense of the term. On the other hand, productive labor refers to the specific actions that are performed in the sphere of production in the material sense, which essentially includes industry and agriculture, to which, as the possibility of crises, ideas which are widely shared by non-Marxist economists, especially Keynes. Marx himself suggested in Capital Volume 2, when discussing the interpenetration of cycles of production and circulation in the rotation of capital. You can, of course, add transportation, communication, and so on, but that does not change the fact that productive labor is taken here in a narrow sense, which limits the first formally linked to the variety of fields of investment of money capital. The reasons for this restriction are clearly political. They make it possible to identify the working class or the proletariat as a social product of the Industrial Revolution, which at the same time creates the material wealth of modern societies and potentially challenges the domination of capital and therefore the continuity of capitalist accumulation. But I insist this is a narrow definition of the sources of valorization. It does not include every salaried activity. And above all, it does not include every exploited labor, especially that exploited labor which, by definition, is not paid by wages or compensated in monetary terms, namely domestic labor, essentially performed by women by way of the historical combination of capitalism in all our societies with patriarchy. And finally, it does not include other broad ranges of activity which are not exactly labor in any direct sense, but nevertheless acquire an important function of valorization and are productive, therefore, from a capitalist point of view. Rather than deducing anything from a purely conceptual argument, I will proceed here in an experimental manner, discussing examples. I will examine two such processes which certainly may rely on the exploitation of labor, but more centrally valorize other dimensions of human life and consumption, where surplus value is also generated, albeit in a generalized sense. So let me break here and suggest to you that what he's trying to do is expand the field of what's being what is what are, what surplus value consists of, and to note that it is not simply financialization or industrial production or manufacture or agriculture or whatever, that there are other forms. And it is these other forms that are more manifest and more capitalized in the current situation. Ooh, and there's a reference to Harriet Farad right here in note 11. Anyway, in dealing with these examples, we must keep in mind the idea that no money, therefore no capital, is valorized if it is not metamorphosed into its polar opposite, a commodity that can be consumed productively in the capitalist sense. You see, you always have to assume that this motion is going on. But we must also keep in mind that labor is not the only form of such a productive consumption. In the terminology of the 1857 Introduction to the Critique of Political Economy, therefore, we must challenge something essential in Marx's understanding of exploitation and face all the political consequences of that rectification. However, the result I propose will not necessarily amount to an erasure of the antagonistic dimension of capitalism. Next section. Surplus health and the accumulation of biocapital. Now, this is the first time, undoubtedly, you've probably heard of this, although perhaps you have heard it elsewhere. But Balibar is, I think, focusing on things that you don't get a wide range of, address on at the theoretical level. But I think it's really important to consider that. And his examples, I think, are very useful. My first example is surplus health. I believe that the term was coined by Joe Dummett in a series of studies, concluding with his book, Drugs for Life. This concept is modeled on surplus value and surplus labor, reversing the perspective from production to a certain consumption, a consumption that is vital since it is the individual's capacity to survive, to live an acceptable life in a given environment that is at stake. This leads to introducing, in symmetry with Marxian labor power, something like a capacity to suffer and to take the drugs and the medical services that restore or simply produce health. What Dummett pursues is a triple phenomenological, statistical, and economic inquiry about the changing definition of health and illness, the continuous increase in consumption of drugs per capita, and finally, the correlative growth of health costs and profits of the pharmaceuticals industry. On the one hand, you have a progressive transformation in the definition of illness, shifting from a pathology that is experienced by subjects as pain or handicap or disorder or disease, diagnosed by a doctor in a clinical relationship to a patient, to an invisible objective condition that is measured or indicated by biomarkers such as cholesterol level, whose quantitative definitions are periodically revised, more or less automatically calling for the prescription of permanent drugs such as statins. This could be described as a form of exploitation of illness as a lived experience, which, of course, subjects may demand themselves or cannot refuse and transform into a demand. On the other hand, you have the transition from a situation where illness is a discontinuous state with huge differences in gravity, duration, and emergency, of course, into a continuous state where the majority of illnesses are chronic conditions, and the fact that the imminent tendency measured by statistics is toward a situation where, with advancing age, individuals consume a maximum number of different drugs as frequently as possible for as long as possible. The reason why we stave off death, I suppose. Hence the ironic play on words in the title, Drugs for Life, drugs to live, or to survive, and drugs for life permanently. Life then becomes, for better or worse, what we can call a prosthetic life, which is, of course, a dependent life. This is the third aspect. Supply precedes demand, and in fact creates it, according to a forceful extension of the liberal law of Marcus, that is, Say's law, J.B. Say. Health costs are continuously growing, at least in developed countries, for part of the population, but an important part of the population. They're distributed among public expenses and private expenses, often covered by insurance, therefore involving a form of credit. And this growth is geared to the growth of profit of the pharmaceuticals industry, which influences laboratories through their determination of conditions at risk, choosing which drugs to develop in a preferential manner, following a calculus of investments and returns. The profits here do not come essentially or not only from production, that is, from valorization in the Marxian sense, although these costs have to be minimized. They come from a different kind of valorization, which directly articulates innovation with increased consumption. This is exactly surplus health, which we may also call a generalized form of surplus value. Kaushik Rajan adds another dimension, which illustrates a new kind of population law at the level of the global economy, and therefore a very important element in understanding the articulation of globalization and financialization. The drugs are mainly consumed in the USA and other developed countries, and they're conceived for this market, but they're tested, that is, subjected to experimental trial in India and other quote unquote southern countries. This is not only because it is in India where important population of unemployed poor make a living in this manner that pharmaceuticals industries can find quote unquote volunteers, i.e., contractual patients who give informed consent. It is above all for scientific sociobiological reasons because it's only in a region where an important population has not yet entered the process of chronic consumption of drugs that you find so-called innocent subjects for trials, subjects whose organism is not already transformed and whose physiological reactions to the drugs thus provide an experimental model for the understanding and adjustment of their effects. With this crucial new set of analyses, we understand that generalized surplus value is a social relation with, at the same time, a local market function and a global system of conditions. Human capital, or labor theory of value reversed human capital, which is my second example, works differently. As we know, this category acquired its strategic function in neoliberal economic theory as an extension of neoclassical reasoning to certain domains which were supposed to be located by nature outside the realm of economic calculus, that is, education, marriage, law and punishment, philanthropy, and so on. Education is especially relevant for our subject. In the work of Gary Becker and others, models are devised which qualitatively correlate an analysis of the component parts of any individual's capacity to be employed at a maximally profitable rate for him or herself and or for an employer who hires him or her. An equation of the costs for the production of such activities through expenses, which can either be public or private, that is personal or most of the time coming from the family, and which ideally must be minimized in comparison to a maximized return. Hence the attempt at evaluating the economic correlation between investments and returns, which justifies the idea that an economic strategy of rational anticipations can be applied, where you define production functions for individual capacities, define the optimal strategy that links time spent in formation, that is, how many years to study and where to study, costs, personal, collective, and benefits in terms of personal earnings over a lifetime. I'm not discussing here whether such models are really effective or predictive, but I want to insist on three aspects which I believe should be articulated. First, it's important to know that the category human capital was not invented in an individualistic perspective. It emerged, in fact, in the 1950s within discussions and plans for the development of newly independent colonies or underdeveloped countries in Asia and Latin America, where it was a question of securing national independence at the economic level. Although through the indigenous development of educational, scientific, and medical resources to perform the productivity and the competitiveness of the population on the world market. The principle was linked to competition not among individuals, but among nations. And it was linked to a certain socialist articulation of decolonization and development, let me note here that Balibar, is a critic of the nation of notions of nation or nationalism. What neoliberalism has achieved here is an appropriation and a transformation of a notion with a social content into a notion with a different social content linked to the decline of the idea of planning and its replacement by the generalization of models of competition. Second, one of the main objectives of Becker's theory is to provide instruments for a quantitative evaluation of the respective merits in terms of costs and returns for individuals of alternative strategies of education, which he calls respectively elitist, more investments for those who predictably will be more successful, and egalitarian, massive investments for institutions which are accessible to all, offering services that, according to their capacities and their ambition or obstinacy, individuals will more or less valorize. This is clearly a political confrontation, and not surprisingly, the result is that elitist systems are more efficient globally than egalitarian systems. Add to this that, again, as a formal consequence of the model, the privatization of educational services, their transference from public institutions to private corporations or to public institutions which apply the same managing strategies as private corporations, is deemed more efficient, provided you keep an optimal proportion between the common education and the professional one. Now, this seems to have a clear class intention, especially if you think that personal investments in the education of children require already existing capital. But it is immediately compounded by the fact that theorists of human capital introduce credit as an essential investment to broaden the range of possibilities for individuals without a patrimony, which is presented as a democratic corrective. The difference between single people and families. Democracy then goes along with mass indebtedness, which is not just an ideological masquerade, but an effective instrument to include a growing number of people in the process of valorization through training. Finally, such a theory and the accompanying tendency in our capitalist societies has a perverse but highly intelligible relationship to the Marxian discourse about the exploitation of labor power and the accumulation of capital. Whereas Marx explained that capital ultimately could be reduced to productive labor, or was nothing other than labor in a different form, appropriated by a different class, the theory of human capital explains that labor, more precisely laboring capacity, see, this is where you can get to labor power, Arbeitsvermögen, can be reduced to capital or become analyzed in terms of capitalist operations of credit, investment, and profitability. Now, this is, of course, what underlies the ideology of the individual as a self-entrepreneur or an entrepreneur of oneself. This ideology is very effective for the same reasons that made Marx's theory of the reduction of social labor to various multiples of the same abstract labor very effective. Namely, the fact that if capitalism requires a impermanence, masses of undifferentiated forces which are displaced more or less brutally from one place of exploitation to another, get those people out of Gaza. It also certainly relies on a permanent differentiation and hierarchization, hierarchization of human capacities that is no longer provided by traditional disciplines or professions, but becomes organized and standardized in capitalist form. Capitalist reproduction or total subsumption. This was, in fact, a point of transition in the direction of defining what I tentatively call absolute capitalism, a steady process of commodification or creation of new fictitious commodities, without which the process of accumulation cannot be maintained, leads to an incorporation of reproduction processes, biological, intellectual, or symbolic, into the valorization process, which metamorphoses human activities into monetary magnitudes accompanied by the increasing function of credit and debt in correlating individual and collective dimensions of the social relation and therefore the definition of capital itself. You can buy some insurance. However simplified, the examples I have discussed articulate the question of valorization, both as formation of value and as addition of new value. So it's both a formation and an addition of new value to an existing capital, with processes of accumulation, commodification, financialization that are not purely based on the exploitation of labor or productive consumption in Marx's terms, but on other uses of living capacities as well. So here we can sort of get around, at least in some ideas, the congealment issue, that congealment jargon. Now, this is not to say that they involve no exploitation or dispossession, as David Harvey rightly insists, hence no latent or open antagonism. Much the contrary. The tendency towards unlimited accumulation remains the driving force of capitalism more than ever. This is why the realization of value has to be planned in advance of every investment. And since private capitals are as liquid as possible, shifting from one sector to another in order to maximize profits, or rather, in today's financial capitalism, to maximize the shareholders' value of assets, this means that so-called rational anticipations are included in the decision of banks and hedge funds to support this or that investment. Without claiming expertise in this matter, Balibar says, I will venture an additional hypothesis. The issue is perhaps not so much to describe a growth of markets for existing products. It is much more to push the range of the market beyond the limits of the production sphere in the traditional sense. Therefore, to add new sources of permanent extra surplus value that can become integrated into valorization, overcoming its limitations because capital is valorized both on the objective side of labor and production and on the subjective side of consumption and use. And this, for me anyway, it makes it clear between, Department 1, Department 2, and how circuits operate and that sort of stuff. I think that's a good way to characterize it. This is why Balibar insists on the importance of the steady, ongoing commodification process. Ultimately, commodification is a commodification of life through its objects and its actions or passions. This is a process that began well before capitalism, and in any case, before the Industrial Revolution. But it continues within capitalism, crossing successive thresholds. Karl Polanyi's category of fictitious commodities is very precious here, provided we do not believe that there is something like a given list of fictitious commodities. On the contrary, such new commodities are continuously invented: health, education, knowledge, entertainment and art, care and sentiments, and so on, which not only produce means for the productive sector itself or for the subsistence of human subjects, the two sectors of Marx's schemes of reproduction, but produce the subjects themselves. However, we must keep in mind the question that is involved in Polanyi's designation, namely whether there are obstacles that prevent commodification from becoming limitless, contradictory effects which from inside or from outside make it impossible for valorization through renewed commodification to proceed slowly. It is the combination of these objective and subjective dimensions that leads me to offer a quasi-Marxian category of quote unquote total subsumption. I have in mind theories of total alienation that can be traced back to various authors, from Hobbes to Rousseau to Marcuse. Above all, I want to continue a reflection that was inaugurated by Marx, albeit left by him in the obscurity of some unpublished texts. Subsumption is an old juridical and philosophical category, which means that something or someone is subjected to a norm or a law or a rule because it is incorporated into a form or becomes informed materially by that norm or a law or rule. The question is, of course, what is subsumed under what? I said something or someone, but the most interesting case probably arises when we introduce the third great ontological category, which is neither thing nor person, or can encompass both, namely actions or agency. This is how Marx uses it in Capital when he describes the transition from formal subsumption to what he calls a real subsumption, the actions of a worker, that is, his or her productive operations, making use of instruments to shape a given matter into a usable object, are being transformed by capitalist manufacture and the Industrial Revolution into quote unquote partial operations of a collective process whose content and rhythm are dictated by the machinery itself, so that the worker can actually produce or do something only in the conditions of the factory under the law of capitalist valorization. Not only must the worker accept the domination of the capitalist market, take the job that's offered to him or her or not by the capitalist, but there is no way he or she could operate manually or intellectually outside that technical and social form. In such a process, continuously repeated, the worker's labor not only becomes abstract labor, it becomes dissociated into partial activities of a process without a subject, working on a robotic factory line, for example. When the formal subsumption, juridically expressed in the wage form, has been fully realized or transformed into real subsumption, exploitation is not just domination, a domination. It is incorporated into the dispositions of human bodies and minds, or radically individualized. But this individuation is also a complete loss of individuality, this time in the sense of individualization or personal identity and autonomy. This explains why Marx expected a liberation not only from another industrial revolution, which would substitute collective capacities or collectively distributed capacities for the current forms of individual activity. In the meantime, however, something else has happened, which I call total subsumption. There are indications of that sense in Marx when he explains that capitalism always wants to have it both ways, exploiting labor not only in the production process, but also in the reproduction process, where workers and their families, social individuals considered proprietors of their own person, consume commodities only in order to reproduce or recreate their labor force. Hence abortion technology. Anyway, as I noted earlier, Marx is largely blind to the fact that in such a reproduction process, which concretely articulates the household with the conditions of the market, an additional form of unpaid domestic labor takes place. But he's not blind to the fact that the market constraints or market logic will increasingly command the quality and quantity of the worker's consumption in order to make it also profitable for capital. Take the example of housing or urban development, to which Engels had drawn attention very early. That is his book on the condition of the working class in England, 1845, or the mass distribution of goods. However, this is only a kind of formal subsumption in the sphere of consumption. Things change radically with the new stages of commodification that I described in terms of surplus health or human capital. Capitalist investment in the caring and education processes themselves. This means two things, apparently. Number one, that the anthropological barrier between work and life, production and reproduction is erased, since reproduction is itself becoming a productive realm in the capitalist sense. Number two, that there is no dimension of individuality, nor, let's make it clear, intersubjectivity, vulnerability, or dependency among individuals that will remain untouched by commodification. No form of life as agency, activity, and passivity, even suffering, even dying, can be lived outside a commodity form and a value form that is, in fact, a moment in the valorization process of capital. This is not a reduction of the individual's life to bare life, as Agamben calls it. In a sense, it's just the opposite. The denaturalization of life, or the production of a quote unquote second nature, albeit not in any form, since every human culture is a second nature, but in purely capitalist form. This is what I call a total subsumption after formal and real subsumption, because total subsumption leaves nothing outside, no reservation for natural life, or anything that's left outside must appear as a residue or a field for further incorporation. Or must it? That is, of course, the whole question, ethical as much as political. Are there limits to commodification? Are there internal and external obstacles? A Lacanian might want to say, uh, every such totalization includes an element of impossibility which belongs to the real. It must be patu, but not whole. Um, If that were the case, the heterogeneous elements, the intrinsic reminders of the total subsumption, could appear in many different forms, some apparently individualistic, such as pathologies or anarchistic resistances, others common or even public. Or they may even become manifest in certain difficulties in implementing the neoliberal agenda, such as the difficulty which is going on right now, such as the difficulty of dismantling a Medicare system once it has been legalized. So I like thinking that this little 2019 piece offers up, the reasons, the vital reasons for continuing certain, socially constructed stuff, like, of course, Medicare, et cetera. Today, Medicaid has been attacked, I think. Anyway, I included a little video of, if you wanted to get a sense of Balibar, a sort of a grand old man of Althusserian thought. Balibar was very important in the 1970s, of course. Where we are now is many, many, many years later. So let me take a look at the chat, see if there are questions or brickbats, fictitious commodities. Sugar. Um, yes, it's anti-democratic in that particular sense. It's no different than what the neo-reactionaries want to do in creating. I put a thing in Discord that was talking about how the Silicon Valley sort of neo-reactionaries want to seize the Presidio, which is a former military base, is a public place. Owned by the federal government in San Francisco. It used to be the headquarters for, all when we were running World War II. It's a beautiful little piece of land and is right below the bridge and is worth a lot. But also, what they want to do is make it into one of those little freedom cities. It's actually too small to be a freedom city, with all due respect. It's just not enough land there to do it. But it's certainly on their little fantasy that they would seize that plus California eventually to make it some sort of techno utopia, similar to the seizing or the attempt to seize major portions of Solano County. So there's that. And of course, it is constructed of a system of fictions. Um, Bruce left. Bye, Bruce. I hope he comes back for Adnan. Um, anyway, so I got through the chat. I hope you found that useful. I'll stop the share and